There was an island where everything had found its balance. Not the kind of balance that looks neat from a distance. Not a postcard. This was a cold, violent place, a slab of volcanic rock roughly 34 kilometers long and 5 kilometers wide, dropped into the Southern Ocean at approximately 54 degrees south latitude, halfway between Australia and Antarctica, in a band of latitude that sailors once called the Furious 50s, because the wind there does not slow down and has nowhere to stop. It builds across thousands of kilometers of open water with nothing in its way. And it arrives at Macquarie Island with everything it has gathered, and yet the island worked. The tussock grasses gripped the slopes, the peat built up over centuries in the wetter ground, royal penguins nested in colonies numbering hundreds of thousands, king penguins gathered on the northern beaches, elephant seals hauled themselves ashore in numbers that made the beaches look like they were moving, albatrosses circled, burrowing petrels honeycombed the soil with tunnels that served as nests. In spring, the noise of Macquarie Island is something you cannot properly describe to someone who has not been there. A layered roar of wind and birds and seals that makes the island feel alive in a way that most places never do. The cats were part of that system. That sentence is uncomfortable. Because cats are not native to Macquarie Island. They arrived the way everything invasive arrives, on a ship in service to human industry. Sealers began working the island in 1810. The camps required provisions. Provisions attracted rats. Rats attracted cats. And cats followed human settlement the way they always have. Opportunistically, effectively. By the time serious scientific monitoring began, the cats were entrenched. They were hunting, burrowing seabirds, killing them in numbers that the evidence did not allow any other reading of. The conservation case was airtight. Remove the cats. Save the seabirds. A straightforward intervention. It took 15 years. By around 2000, the cat population of Macquarie Island had been eradicated. The last cat was gone. What happened instead of recovery was a catastrophe so complete, so expensive, and so instructive that it became a case study taught in ecology programs worldwide. And it has everything to say about what balance actually costs. And what it costs when you remove something from a living system without understanding everything that something was doing for free. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second. Because what happened on Macquarie Island is not just a conservation story. It is a budget story. It is a story about the invisible line items in every living system. The services being rendered for free that only become visible as costs when they stop being rendered. Think of everything the cats were managing as something held in trust. The rabbit population below carrying capacity. The tussock root system still holding the slopes. The biological stability of an entire island and a 2002 Tasmanian Parks and Wildlife. Internal risk assessment that modeled herbivore acceleration scenarios post-eradication and was filed and not acted on. This channel is about living well on less, about understanding systems before you cut from them. Subscribe if you have not. Hit the notification bell. What this island teaches about the economics of real balance applies directly to every homestead, every small property, every low-cost life where you are trying to make a system work for you instead of against you. Now, back to the island. Macquarie Island sits at 54 degrees 30 minutes south, 158 degrees 57 minutes east, administered as an external territory of Australia by the state of Tasmania. It is also one of the most ecologically significant pieces of land on the planet. It is the only place on Earth where rocks from the Earth's mantle are exposed above sea level, the result of a geological process that pushed oceanic crust upward rather than subducting it. Scientists did not fully understand what they were looking at when they first surveyed it in the 19th century. What they could see was the wildlife, and the wildlife alone justified the island's addition to the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1997. The numbers are staggering. Royal penguins number around 850,000 individuals across approximately 57 colonies. King penguins maintain a resident population of around 70,000 birds. There are 4 species of albatross nesting on the island, 3 species of giant petrel, and dozens of other species that use Macquarie as the only significant landmass within flying range for their nesting season. Southern elephant seals haul out in numbers that can reach tens of thousands at a time. This is what the island is, one of the great wildlife stations of the Southern Ocean, and it functions because the island provides land, the land provides vegetation, the vegetation provides nesting habitat, and the nesting habitat provides the platform on which millions of organisms base their entire survival. Every piece of this system performs a function. Every function has a value, and when a piece is removed, the value of that function does not disappear. It just converts from free to expensive. The sealers who began working Macquarie Island in 1810 were not thinking about ecology. They were thinking about oil and skins. The elephant seal harvest was industrially organized, and at its peak the industry was removing hundreds of thousands of seals each year. The population crashed. The industry reorganized and eventually stopped, though not before permanently altering the island's ecological baseline. The rats arrived with the first ships. They were never seriously controlled, because controlling rats was expensive, and rats were tolerable as long as the camps were producing. The rabbits arrived in 1879, introduced deliberately as a food source for castaways who might be stranded on the island. This was standard practice in the era of sail. Ships went down without warning, and survivors might find themselves on remote islands with nothing to eat. Stocking islands with rabbits was considered a humanitarian precaution. The logic made sense in the context of the time. The consequences were invisible until they were not. By the mid-20th century, the rabbit population had grown substantially, but the cats, present since the 1820s, were keeping it in partial check. Cats hunting rabbits. Cats also hunting rats. Cats also hunting burrowing petrels and other ground-nesting birds, which was the problem that became visible. The system was not natural. It was not clean. It was a system of competing pressures, predator suppressing herbivore suppressing vegetation versus predator suppressing seabird, and it had found a grim equilibrium. When the Australian Antarctic Division and the Tasmanian Parks and Wildlife Service began addressing the invasive species problem seriously in the 1980s, the focus fell on cats first. The evidence was compelling. Burrowing petrels, which nest in underground burrows in the peat and soil and are completely defenseless against any predator that can find those burrows, were being killed in catastrophic numbers. The cats were efficient hunters. They knew the terrain. They had been adapting to this island for 100 years. They operated at night, in the tussock grass, along the slope lines where the burrows were most densely concentrated. The decision to eradicate the cats was made on the strongest available scientific evidence at the time. It was not a reckless decision. It was not an uninformed one. It was a decision based on the part of the system that was visible. The cats killing the seabirds without a complete account of the part that was not visible, which was what the cats were preventing. The eradication program ran from the 1980s through approximately 2000, using a combination of trapping, shooting, and poisoning across terrain that includes steep volcanic slopes and dense, matted tussock grass in some of the worst weather in the Southern Hemisphere. By around 2000, the program was complete. The cats were gone. The seabirds did begin recovering. That part of the prediction was correct. The burrows refilled. The burrowing petrel colonies began expanding again in areas where cat predation had been heaviest. But the cats had been doing something else. Something that did not appear in the models with enough weight, or appeared and was not acted on. The cats had been hunting rabbits, not controlling the rabbit population absolutely, but suppressing it, holding it below the threshold where the rabbits would consume the island's vegetation faster than it could recover. The cats were a biological ceiling on the herbivore load the island was carrying. Remove the ceiling, and the load lifts. The numbers are difficult to convey without the baseline. In the early 2000s, the rabbit population on Macquarie Island was estimated at around 10,000. By 2006, estimates had risen above 100,000, a tenfold increase in approximately 6 years. And rabbits they eat everything within reach. They eat the tussock grasses that hold the slopes. They eat the cushion plants in the boggy areas. They eat the seedlings before those seedlings can establish. They eat the bases of established plants severing the root systems at ground level so that the plant dies from beneath while nothing visible happens at the surface until the plant simply falls. What followed the rabbit explosion was one of the most dramatic vegetation collapses in the documented history of island ecology. By the mid-2000s, aerial surveys of Macquarie Island showed the scale of what was happening. The tussock grass, the dominant vegetation on the island's slopes, the plant that held the peat in place, the plant whose root systems were the structural integrity of the topsoil, was gone from large sections of the island. Bare soil was visible from aircraft, and bare soil on a sub-Antarctic island exposed to furious 50s weather does not remain stable. When the tussock goes, the peat underneath is exposed to wind that strips it and rain that carves channels into it, and the slope begins to move. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what tussock grass actually is and what it does. Tussock grass on Macquarie Island grows in dense, elevated clumps that can reach a meter or more in height. The root systems of these clumps extend deep into the peat and bind it. Between the clumps, mosses and smaller plants fill the gaps, and the whole system acts as a living mat over the slope, holding water, holding soil, buffering the wind, providing habitat below and above. It is not decorative, it is structural. It is doing the engineering work that holds the island together. When the rabbits removed it, the slopes were exposed, and exposed slopes on an island sitting in some of the worst wind on the planet do not stay intact. Landslides occurred, not metaphorical shifts or gradual changes in slope angle. Actual landslides, with thousands of tons of soil and peat moving downslope, accelerating, and arriving at the beaches carrying everything that had been living on the slopes above. These slides destroyed seabird colonies that had been recovering from cat predation. The burrowing petrels whose burrows had been expanding as the cats disappeared were now being buried and suffocated by the debris of slopes collapsing on top of them. The seabirds, the cat eradication had been designed to protect, were being killed by the consequence of removing the cats. This is not a story about good intentions producing bad outcomes through bad luck. It is a story about complex systems and what happens when you manage a part of one without accounting for the whole. The concept scientists use to describe this kind of consequence is a trophic cascade. A trophic cascade is what happens when you remove or add one element from a food web, and the effects travel up and down through the system in ways that were not predicted. The most famous documented example is the wolves of Yellowstone National Park. Wolves were exterminated from Yellowstone in the 1920s. In their absence, elk populations grew and grazed the riverbanks heavily. The vegetation declined. The banks eroded into the rivers widened and shallowed. Beaver habitat disappeared. The beavers left, and the dams that had been creating wetlands across the landscape were no longer maintained. By the time wolves were reintroduced in 1995, Yellowstone had been fundamentally altered by the absence of a single predator. Through the slow accumulated weight of every meal, the elk ate that the wolves were no longer preventing. When the wolves returned, the rivers began narrowing and the banks stabilizing. The willows grew back. The beavers returned. Scientists described it as the wolves changing the rivers, and the phrase caught because it captured something true. A predator at the top of a food web is not just hunting. Through everything it prevents from being eaten, it is shaping the landscape itself. The cats on Macquarie Island were doing the same thing. Not wolves, not elk, not riverbanks, but the structural logic was identical. The predator was suppressing the herbivore. The suppressed herbivore was being prevented from consuming the vegetation beyond the vegetation's capacity to recover. The vegetation was holding the slopes. Remove the predator, and the herbivore expands, and the vegetation collapses, and the slopes move. What the Yellowstone story had that the Macquarie Island story initially lacked was institutional memory of what had been there before. With wolves, scientists had been documenting the pre-wolf absence ecosystem for decades before reintroduction. They had baselines. They knew what they were trying to restore. On Macquarie Island, the baseline had been obscured. The island had never existed without cats in the era of systematic scientific monitoring. What the island looked like before 1810, before the first sealing ships arrived. before the rats and rabbits and cats and the industrial disruption of the seal populations, existed only in the soil layers, in the pollen record, in the bones of the birds that had nested there before the disruption began. Nobody had measured it. Nobody had built a model of what the island's herbivore load would do without a biological ceiling in place. The Australian government recognized the scale of the problem in 2007. A joint program was announced between the Australian Department of the Environment, Water, Heritage, and the Arts and the Tasmanian government, the Macquarie Island Pest Eradication Project. The target was total eradication of all 3 remaining invasive mammal species from the island: rabbits, rats, and mice. The budget was $24.7 million Australian dollars. $24.7 million to correct a cascading failure that had been set in motion, in part, by removing the cats. The program ran from 2010 to 2014. The primary tool was aerial brotifacum baiting, helicopter-dropped poison pellets distributed across the entire surface of the island. Deploying a second-generation anticoagulant rodenticide across an island that contains hundreds of thousands of nesting seabirds required precise timing, with bait drops scheduled for periods when seabirds were at sea rather than on land, and penguin colonies temporarily displaced to buffer zones. After the aerial phase, teams moved through the island on foot, shooting any surviving rabbits that had avoided the initial poisoning. The island had to be treated as completely as possible, because a single breeding pair left behind would restart the problem. The program worked. By 2014, Macquarie Island was declared free of rabbits, rats, and mice, the first time since the 1820s. Within months of the eradication being declared, the vegetation response was visible. Tussock grass began returning to slopes that had been bare soil. Erosion features stabilized as root systems re-established. The seabird populations that had been disrupted by the landslides began moving back toward their historical nesting sites. Recovery is real, but it cost $24.7 million, 4 years of intensive operation, and decades of ecosystem damage that will take a generation to fully reverse. Before we move on to the wider accounting, stop for a second, because this island just ran a budget. Not in dollars at first, in biological services, in structural work performed by living organisms for free, in the invisible labor of predators managing herbivore populations across a century. When the accounting broke down, the cost converted into dollars, into eroded slopes, into buried seabird colonies, into a helicopter dropping poison across a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Subscribe if you have not. This is what balance is worth when you can finally price it. The reason this story belongs in a conversation about low-cost living is precisely because of what that $24.7 million bill represents. When people think about living cheaply, the conversation almost always focuses on consumption, on buying less, producing more, reducing the overhead of being alive in a money economy. Those conversations are valuable and necessary, but they frequently miss something that Macquarie Island illustrates with unusual clarity. The cost of maintaining a living system is never zero, and the cost of failing to maintain it is always higher than the maintenance would have been. The cats on Macquarie Island were providing what economists call an ecosystem service. They were performing a biological function, population suppression of rabbits, that had real economic value, even though that value was invisible as long as it was being delivered for free. When it was removed, the value became visible through the cost of its absence. $24.7 million to do mechanically, with helicopters and brotifacum and teams of shooters in violent weather, what the cats had been doing biologically, for nothing, for nearly 2 centuries. This pattern appears everywhere that self-sufficient living is practiced at scale. On a homestead, the equivalent of the Macquarie Island cats might be a small flock of chickens kept primarily for eggs. The eggs are the visible return, the ledger item you can point to. But the chickens are also working the soil during their ranging time, consuming the slug and grub populations that would otherwise damage the vegetable beds, fertilizing the grass with droppings that replace nutrient inputs you would otherwise buy, and breaking the parasite cycle in the pasture through the way their movement disrupts larvae in the soil. Remove the chickens because the feed cost in a difficult season is too high. and the feed cost saving is real and immediate. But the account is not complete until you add back the increased pest pressure in the beds, the fertilizer you now have to source separately, the parasite load in the grass, the reduced productivity of the vegetable system that the chickens had been supporting. The saving in feed may be offset entirely by costs that accumulate slowly and are attributed to other causes because they are not as immediate as the feed bill. On a small farm, the parallel might be the hedge line cleared to allow larger machinery to work more efficiently. The efficiency gain is real, but the hedge had been providing windbreak that reduced irrigation cost, overwintering habitat for predatory insects that kept pest populations manageable, and root systems that held the soil edge during heavy rain. The machine works the field faster. The accounting is incomplete until those services are valued. The Macquarie Island story is the most dramatic available version of this universal principle. Because it happened on an island, a bounded, isolated system where consequences could not disperse across surrounding territory, the feedback was rapid and total. The slopes collapsed. The numbers were visible from aircraft. The cost was eventually quantifiable to a specific budget line. On a mainland farm or homestead, the same principles operate, but the consequences spread across wider areas and longer timescales, which makes them invisible until they become undeniable, by which point they are expensive. Dana Bergstrom, the Australian ecologist who led research into the Macquarie Island vegetation collapse, framed the lesson clearly. The mistake was not in removing the cats. The seabird evidence justified that intervention. The mistake was in not recognizing that the cats were embedded in a system and that removing one element without tracking its connections to everything else would produce consequences the single-element analysis could not predict. The lesson formalized in restoration ecology from this experience is that you cannot manage a part of a living system in isolation. You can only manage the system. Any intervention that treats a single factor without accounting for its interactions with the rest of the system is an incomplete intervention, and incomplete interventions produce incomplete outcomes. For low-cost living, this translates directly and practically. You cannot manage your heating bill in isolation from your insulation and building envelope. You cannot manage your food production cost in isolation from your soil health and the biological activity in that soil. You cannot manage your water cost in isolation from your land's capacity to absorb, hold, and release water over time. These are systems. They interact. Optimizing one element at the expense of the system as a whole is how you create expensive problems out of problems that were already being solved for free. The island economy and the household economy are not different in kind. They are different in scale. And the island economy has the advantage of being legible. Its feedback loops are tight enough that the consequences show up fast enough to be documented. Other islands in other parts of the world learned related versions of the same lesson through their own expensive experiences. The islands of Hawaii have lost dozens of endemic bird species to introduced rats and mongooses. The mongooses were introduced in 1883 to control rats in the sugarcane fields. The problem was that rats are primarily nocturnal and mongooses are primarily diurnal, so their hunting hours rarely overlapped. The mongooses instead redirected their hunting toward ground-nesting birds and eggs, which had no evolved defenses against them. The rats continued. The birds declined from both. And the mongoose became an additional entrenched problem that Hawaii is still managing at significant cost. Lord Howe Island, an Australian external territory east of New South Wales, faced its own reckoning. Black rats arrived in 1918 when a supply ship ran aground, and within years had caused the extinction of 5 endemic bird species. A rat eradication program involving aerial rodenticide baiting was declared successful in 2020 after requiring a second treatment phase to address survivors. The cost ran above $9 million Australian dollars. Round Island, off the coast of Mauritius, tells a more successful version of the story. Introduced rabbits and goats had degraded the native vegetation and suppressed the endemic reptile populations. The herbivores were removed in staged phases with careful monitoring at each stage. The reptile populations have partially recovered. The endemic palms have regrown in areas that were bare within living memory. In each of these cases, the economic logic runs identically. The cost of the intervention is always legible, always immediate, always reducible to a specific budget figure that can be put in a headline. The cost of inaction, or the cost of an incomplete action that creates a secondary problem while solving the original one, is usually invisible until it compounds into something that forces a response, by which point the secondary response is more expensive than a complete initial approach would have been. The people who manage to live genuinely well on small amounts of money, on islands, on homesteads, on small farms, in off-grid communities, are people who have learned to account for the invisible costs before they compound. They understand that every element of their living system is providing services that have real value, and that removing any element without understanding what it was doing is how you create expensive problems out of ones that were already solved. This is not an argument for never changing anything. Systems do need adjustment. Costs do need to be cut. The discipline required is not paralysis, it is seeing the whole before acting on a part. It is asking, before every intervention, what else will change? The people who do this well share a consistent characteristic. They watch their systems before they act on them. They ask not just what the thing they want to remove is doing that they can observe, but what it might be doing that they cannot yet observe. And they attempt, imperfectly, to account for both. What would a genuinely accounting-complete version of the Macquarie Island cat eradication have looked like? It would have involved a staged approach, reducing the cat population in carefully monitored phases, while simultaneously tracking rabbit numbers, so that intervention could begin before the tussock was compromised. It would have required the researchers and policymakers to hold the whole system in view while intervening in one part of it. The actual eradication solved a single defined problem: cats killing seabirds, and succeeded at that specific task. What it failed to anticipate was the second-order consequence of the problem it simultaneously left unsolved. This is the discipline that separates genuinely low-cost living from the illusion of it, not cutting every visible cost, but tracing every cost to its source. Accounting for the services being provided that you are not currently paying for, because when the system breaks, the cost of those services converts from invisible to undeniable. The tussock grass is growing back on Macquarie Island now. The seabird colonies are recovering. The soil is rebuilding in sections where erosion had stripped it bare. Recovery is real. But it required 4 years of intensive helicopter operations and $24.7 million to create the conditions for that recovery. The rabbits are gone. The rats are gone. The mice are gone. The cats are gone. The island is being managed now as a system, with monitoring protocols that treat every element as connected to every other, and response plans for reinvasion that would have seemed overcautious before 2006, and now seem obviously necessary. The lesson is paid for. The tussock is coming back, and somewhere in the accounting of this island's history, there is a line that will never appear on any budget document, the line that represents what the cats were providing for a century and a half, before anyone thought to ask what would happen when they stopped. A cat could have done it for free. That is the lesson Macquarie Island has to offer anyone trying to build a life on less. The most expensive things are usually not the things that appear on the invoice. They are the things you stopped doing, the systems you stopped maintaining, the services you took for granted because they were being provided by something you had not thought to value until it was gone. The island teaches that those free services are never truly free. They are purchased by the integrity of the system that provides them. And when the system breaks, the bill arrives. Make of that what you will.